Now the president has announced plans to go back to Arizona, presumably for another high-minded, soothing performance like that. But now, the mayor of Phoenix, Arizona, is asking the president to please stay away. Please don't do it. Please don't come to our city. How is that one going to end? The Phoenix mayor joins us next. The president has just announced he wants to do a campaign-style rally next week in Phoenix, Arizona. The mayor of Phoenix is asking the president to not do it, and he's raising the question of why the president wants to do it in the first place. The mayor says, quote, "Our nation is still healing from the tragic events in Charlottesville. If President Trump is coming to Phoenix to announce a pardon for recently convicted former Sheriff Joe Arpaio, then it will be clear that his true intent is to inflame emotions and further divide our nation." Joining us now is Greg Stanton. He's the mayor of Phoenix, Arizona. Mayor Stanton, I really appreciate your time tonight, sir. Thanks for being with us.
Happy to be here, Rachel.
Let me just ask first if the White House has responded at all to your request that the president should cancel this event.
Well, they've not responded directly to me, but all indications are the campaign-style rally in Phoenix will occur on Tuesday night. And as I said in my statement, it's very, very unfortunate. It's ill-timed after the tragic events in Charlottesville and the very disappointing response of our president to unequivocally condemn racism, unequivocally condemn white supremacy, to have this campaign-style rally, and then obviously to openly discuss the possibility of pardoning Sheriff Joe Arpaio. The timing could not be worse.
Do you think there's a connection between the events of Charlottesville, between the president's recent bellicose statements on race, and his choice specifically of Phoenix? Do you think race is part of the reason why he's coming to your city and why he's coming to Arizona?
Well, I think the reaction of the President Trump to the tragic events in Charlottesville, where racists and Nazis and white nationalists, one of them engaged in murder of a young lady, his unwillingness to unequivocally condemn white supremacy in the United States of America was shocking to us, so disappointing to so many of us, and his willingness to consider a pardon of Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who systematically violated the civil rights of so many Latinos residents in our community for so long, made them live in terror. I do believe there's an unfortunate connection there. And so I think the timing of the rally is really, really bad. And even considering a pardon for this sheriff who terrorized our residents is a really bad thing as well. Put it together, it's a bad, bad combination.
Are you worried about violence or major protests if the president does show up?
Yes, I am. And I know that people from around the country, because he's announced this and put it on his social media, that he'll be doing this campaign-style rally, openly teasing that he might be pardoning Sheriff Joe Arpaio, the criminally convicted Sheriff Joe Arpaio, that he might be pardoning him. People have put it together, and I think this might be happening at this event. So, yes, we're expecting many, many people from around the country to attend. And I am concerned about what the purpose of doing is to inflame passions. I'm concerned about what might happen as a result.
Greg Stanton, the mayor of Phoenix, Arizona. This event fast approaching Tuesday next week. Stay in touch with us over the next few days, Mr. Mayor, if you don't mind. We'd love to just be able to follow this story through your eyes in terms of how you see this unfolding.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll be right back. Stay with us. Programming note, there have been a few Fridays this summer when I have not been here, and we have shown other stuff at this hour on a Friday night. Tomorrow is not one of those Fridays. I will be here with bells on tomorrow night. I will see you then. Now, though, it is time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Good evening, Rachel. I am very proud to announce that I have Bill Moyers joining us tonight. We've been trying to get him for a long time. And as you know, on his website, he has a timeline of the Russia investigation that is invaluable, with 400 data points built the way prosecutors build their timelines.
I was looking at that today, and the amazing thing about it is that they don't just lay everything out linearly. If you're curious about where one person appears in the story and who else they're connected to, you can sort the entire timeline by individual characters in the drama. It's the most useful thing that I have ever seen anybody lay out online about the whole story.
And you know what it is? It's a great homework device for Rachel Maddow viewers, so that they can stay right up to speed with where we are right now.
It also helps you cheat on the test, because that's where the teacher is learning stuff. Or terrorist attacks in Spain. The terrorist attack earlier today in Barcelona at this hour is known to have claimed 13 lives. with another 80 people injured. There was a confusing sequence of reports all day long as to exactly what happened in that attack, the number of attackers, whether or not the perpetrators were all known and were all in custody, or were any of them dead. Those reports evolved in a confusing way over the course of today. There's also been confusion all day greeting this claim of responsibility for that attack that was issued by the terrorist group ISIS. Now, it's not inconceivable that ISIS members or people inspired by or adhering to ISIS ideology could have carried out this attack. This is very much in keeping with their style and their tactics of terrorism in the West. What was unusual about this claim of responsibility from ISIS today is that in the past, ISIS hasn't claimed attacks like this. They haven't identified itself. They haven't identified their adherents as the perpetrators of terrorist acts like this, while anybody associated with the crime was still at large or was in custody. As a pattern, ISIS tends to only claim responsibility for attacks once all the attackers are known to be dead. The thinking is that ISIS doesn't want to give investigators an angle to use against any living suspects to try to pry information out of them about their ISIS affiliations or their ISIS contacts. So ISIS doesn't generally claim attacks in the West until the people who committed the attacks are known to be dead. So ISIS claiming responsibility for this Barcelona attack today, while the alleged attackers were not dead and were either at large or in custody, that was weird. That's an unusual thing. And we're going to be talking live in just a couple of minutes with a reporter who specializes in ISIS and Al-Qaeda and who's become one of the foremost experts in the world in terms of explaining their MO, their strategy, and how they remote control attacks in places like Western Europe from their home base in Iraq and Syria. So we've got that live report with that expert reporter coming up in just a moment. But here's the latest in terms of what we know about the terrorist attack in Barcelona today. And perhaps another attempted attack that Spanish police may have just thwarted tonight in a city south of Barcelona, a police operation that took place just in the last hour or so. In the Barcelona attack from earlier today, as of this hour, Spanish authorities say 13 people were killed. Actually, the number of injured, I said earlier, was 80 people. It's up to 100 people said to be injured. 15 of those people injured very seriously. That happened when a van deliberately plowed through a crowded pedestrian thoroughfare in the heart of Barcelona. The van drove down this popular pedestrian plaza. It was filled with tourists and shoppers on a beautiful summer day. Witnesses reported that the van actually zigzagged down that pedestrian plaza for several hundred yards, apparently trying to hit as many people as possible before the van finally came to a stop. The driver then fled the vehicle. And Spanish police today were saying that the driver of the van, after he fled the vehicle, he is still at large. Now, the police say they have taken 2 people into custody. They're saying neither of those people was the driver. But then that brings us to what just happened in the past hour. We've been getting reports in the last hour of a police operation in a different Spanish city, the city of Cambrils, which is about 75 miles south of Barcelona. We always have a note of caution whenever we are reporting stuff very close to the time that it happened. Whenever there are terrorist attacks, particularly ones that where we're getting translated contacts with foreign police services and everything, often the initial story changes once we ultimately understand the truth of what happened. And so I will give you a cautionary note that there are still conflicting reports as to exactly what happened this evening, whether police were responding to a second attempted terror attack or whether this second incident tonight was actually just a police operation against the perpetrators of the Barcelona attack, and it wasn't a second attempt to kill people by a terrorist cell of some kind in Spain. We'll let you know as soon as we have more clarity on that. But whatever the second operation was tonight, police do say they have killed several alleged perpetrators. So again, was it another attack? We don't know. Was this the police moving in on the people who committed today's earlier attack? We don't yet know. Those are the 2 things that we knew about as of this evening heading into showtime. And then in a town about an hour further south from Cambrils, we're now being told to expect a connection with an incident that happened last night. That when it happened last night, we didn't know to see it as anything other than a one-off. But south of Cambrils last night, there was an explosion that actually leveled a house. And when that happened last night, again, we didn't know it was connected to anything, but Spanish authorities are now saying that explosion last night may be linked to today's attack in Barcelona. A senior U.S. official who was briefed by Spanish authorities is telling NBC News tonight that investigators in Spain are looking at that explosion last night to see if that house might have been some kind of bomb-making factory connected to a terror cell that then struck in Barcelona today and that maybe struck in Cambrils tonight. Authorities say one theory they're investigating is the possibility that today's truck attack on that pedestrian area in central Barcelona, maybe that was actually a rushed attack as a result of that explosion last night that blew up that house. Perhaps a bomb plot was the original plan, and then the vehicle attack in Barcelona today was a plan B after the attackers lost their source of explosives and they worried that their cell might be unraveled as investigators followed the leads from that explosive blast that happened last night. As I said, these are all open questions at this point. We will learn more as this unfolds. We'll learn more in days ahead. But the tactic in the downtown Barcelona attack today, the use of a vehicle to target pedestrians, we have seen a bunch of attacks like this recently. Right? Beyond the parallel that a lot of Americans have very fresh in our minds today because of the fatal vehicle-borne attack by an apparent white supremacist in Charlottesville, Virginia this weekend. We've seen 6 vehicle-borne terrorist attacks in Europe just in the past year, all of them with multiple fatalities. The attack that stands out as most similar to today's was the one that happened in Nice, in France, last July, when a man plowed a large truck into a crowd of pedestrians that was celebrating Bastille Day. He careened over a mile down a seaside promenade in Nice. He killed 86 people. But that's probably the most high-profile one. It's not the only one. Just before Christmas last year, a man slammed a truck into a holiday market in Berlin. That killed 12 people. In March of this year, a man drove a car into pedestrians on Westminster Bridge in London. That killed 4 people before the attacker got out of the car and stabbed a police officer to death. Then the following month, April, in Stockholm, Sweden, a man hijacked a delivery truck, smashed it into a department store. He hit a slew of pedestrians on the way. 5 people were killed in that attack. Then the month after that, in June, in London again, 8 people killed when 3 men in a van deliberately ran down pedestrians on London Bridge. Then they got out of the vehicle and stabbed several people before being shot to death by police. There have been a whole series of multiple fatality, vehicle as heavy weapon attacks on innocent civilians in the past few months. But today's vehicle-borne attack in Barcelona is the first attack of this kind for Spain. That said, the last mass attack in Spain with multiple casualties was more than a decade ago. It was actually one of the most deadly terror attacks ever on European soil. Spain, of course, was home to the Madrid train bombings that happened in 2004.
Good evening. Spain, a partner of the United States in the Iraq War, was hit by a massive and deadly terrorist attack today, killing more than 190 people, wounding more than 1,000 in Madrid, the Spanish capital.
Today's attack is, for this country, the equivalent of America's September 11th.
Today in Spain, life changed in an instant. At 7:39 a.m., 13 bombs, one after another, exploded in less than 20 minutes, ripping through packed commuter trains during the height of rush hour. Police say some bombs were placed in backpacks on board the trains, others hidden on the train tracks.
What it means is that terrorist groups now see a high body count, as many body bags as possible, as the true objective of their attacks. It's not just a political message anymore. It's something much more radical, and that is a very disturbing development.
One expert said countries need to understand it won't be easy to say the war on terror is over, even if Osama bin Laden is caught.
Either Islamic groups, Islamic militant groups, are able to stage massive attacks without him, or other groups that have nothing to do with al-Qaeda or Islamic terrorism are now adopting the means of al-Qaeda and targeting major infrastructures and civilians to sort of show, look, we can be as bad as them.
That massive attack in Spain was 13 years ago in Madrid. Osama bin Laden wouldn't be killed for another 7 years. And of course, ISIS didn't even exist yet in 2004, certainly not in its current form. But the evolution that terrorism analysts were talking about even then has continued. And the attacks that ISIS promotes around the world now are not the massive kind like the Madrid train bombings, but the kind that we saw in Barcelona today. And in Nice last July, and in Berlin at Christmas time, and in London, a handful of people, or just one person, using the means closest to hand, a vehicle, to kill as many people as possible. The ISIS-affiliated media outlet Amaq has claimed today's attack. Again, it is unusual for them to claim responsibility for an attack before we know that all the perpetrators of the attack are dead. They don't tend to like to give investigators a way to try to pressure their interrogation suspects into giving up their ISIS contacts. If this was ISIS, what does that tell us about what might happen next? And if this was ISIS, why are they claiming responsibility now and breaking their previous pattern of how they have handled other attacks like this? Joining us now from Barcelona is NBC correspondent Claudio Luvanga. Claudio, thank you for staying up into the middle of the night with us to help us understand this. What can you tell us about this, the investigation right now, and also about what we're hearing, this possible second attack this evening?
Well, that's right, Rachel. Well, there is no respite from the specter of terror here in Spain, isn't it? Only hours after that van plowed into the crowd in La Rambla, one of the most popular, if not the most popular avenue here in Barcelona, and very famous all across Europe as well. That's always packed with tourists and with residents going shopping on the stalls, heading down to the sea, because that Rambla goes from the center of the city down to the sea, and it will have been particularly packed today because it's August, because it's summer. And look at it now. Behind me is the Plaza de Catalunya, one of the main squares here, and usually at this time of the year this place is bustling with tourists and residents. And look at it now. Not even on Christmas Day you see Barcelona so empty, so eerie. This is what you feel here. It's an eerie sensation, and the fact that the driver of the van managed to run away, to get away, the fact that only hours after that attack, there is another terrorist attack in a town that is only 2 hours south of Barcelona. The fact that 2 people have been arrested in connection to the Barcelona attack. 4 people have been killed in this other terrorist attack, plus another one seriously injured, the police said, can only mean that there is a wider organization at play. We don't know yet, of course, whether these 2 terrorist attacks are related, but the fact that there are so many people involved suggests at least that there was some kind of organization behind it, and it's not, as in the case, for instance, of London, the lone wolf having just decided to run people over, and that was it. Rachel?
Let me just ask you one question about this second attack, Claudia. Thank you for that understanding in terms of what we're looking at behind you and how eerie it is in Barcelona. It's hard for me from this distance to get any kind of sense of what might have been the target of the second attack. If in Cambril that wasn't just a police action chasing down the perpetrators, but in fact that was a second attempted attack, one that either police just responded to or were able to interrupt. Do we have any detail or any understanding about what might have been the target for the second attack?
Well, I can't speculate on that yet because the police hasn't revealed any information on why were they there and why they carried out the attack there. But what I can tell you is that Cambrils is down south, about 2.5 hours drive. And then if you drive another 45 minutes south, that is another town, a town when on Wednesday night an explosion took place. And on Wednesday night, they thought that that was the cause of a gas leak. But as you mentioned in your intro at the top of your program, now they believe there could be a connection between that explosion and today's attack in Barcelona, and perhaps the one in Cambrils. It could have been a bomb-making factory where the explosion just went off and they had to rush these 2 attacks. And the fact that these 2 towns are not so far from each other, well, that could be an indication that all these 3 towns, so the town south of Cambrils and Barcelona, could be related, Rachel.
NBC's Claudia Luvanga reporting tonight from Barcelona. Claudia, thank you for being up, especially given how late it is there. I really appreciate you joining us tonight. Thank you. Joining us now from Iraq, where she is reporting on ISIS, is Rukmini Callimachi. She's the New York Times foreign correspondent who focuses on ISIS and al-Qaeda. Rukmini, thank you for being here. I know it's also the dead of night there. I really appreciate you being with us.
My pleasure, Rachel. Nice to be with you.
So I was talking a few moments ago about basically what I have learned from you and your reporting at the New York Times about what to watch for in ISIS claims of responsibility. Before we got word of this second attack, possibly, or at least the second police action tonight, which appears to have left 4 people dead and another person seriously injured at the hands of police, we did get what appears to be a claim of responsibility from ISIS. Am I right that that's unusual? How do you view that?
It is unusual if we assume that the 2 people that are in custody now are the perpetrators of this attack. I don't know if they are the actual actors of the attack, but you are right. ISIS in general does not claim attacks when their assailants are still at large, specifically because, as we assume, they are not trying to create a case against them and make it easier for police to put them away.
In terms of what we know about the operation today, we don't yet, it's always hard in the immediate aftermath of these things to know what's connected. It's possible that that house that blew up south of Barcelona last night really was a gas leak, and it wasn't a bomb, and it wasn't connected to these things. It's possible that this action tonight was somehow a separate course from what we saw today with that van attack in Barcelona. But if it turns out that these things are connected, that there was an explosives component, that there was a vehicle-borne attack, that there were surviving attackers who then mounted a second attack after this spectacular event in Barcelona today. Does that tell you anything in terms of whether this is, inspired by ISIS rather than directed by ISIS, whether this is homegrown, whether this might have been directed from abroad?
Just starting with the very first attack, the van attack, we know that there were at least 2 people that came out of that car. So already we know that the lone wolf hypothesis is out of the question. There were at least 2 people that were directly involved in that attack. The police have been pretty forceful on their Twitter feed in saying that the gas attack, the attack that we believed was a gas attack from last night, and the Cambril attack appear to have some connection to this. This is their working theory right now. And if that theory proves to be correct, then we're talking about a multi-site terrorist attack. That takes planning, that takes a network, that takes resources, and that to me suggests something more than an inspired attack. This could be a true directed ISIS attack.
Rukmini, one last question for you. I mentioned in the introduction that Spain, of course, was home to the absolutely devastating Madrid train bombings in 2004. And we've also been told that Spain has been sort of a way station, a stopping off point for Western European fighters who are leaving home to go fight with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. That said, Spain has not been the target of a lot of the style attacks that we've seen in London, in Berlin, in Nice. Do you have any sense of how Spain is viewed as a particular target by ISIS in this current iteration of ISIS?
If this attack is indeed ISIS, it is the first ISIS attack in Spain, the very first one. So you are completely correct in portraying it that way. Spain is much lower down than France, than the UK, than the United States, than even Germany in ISIS's rhetoric. Those other countries have been repeatedly threatened by ISIS, and Spain has been threatened, but much less so. The very first terrorist attack that I covered on this beat when I joined the New York Times was the Charlie Hebdo attack in January of 2015. In Paris, and the Hypercacher attack at a supermarket a couple days later. The man who did the Hypercacher attack, Amedy Coulibaly, is considered the first ISIS-inspired, directed attacker in France. And before he did that attack, he traveled to Spain, specifically to Madrid, to drop off his girlfriend so that she could catch a flight to Istanbul and join the caliphate and essentially be spared imprisonment afterwards. So before this attack, like you said, I used to view Spain very much as a way station, not as a place that would necessarily host its own attack. But obviously, the events of the last hours have radically changed that.
Rukmini Callimachi, New York Times foreign correspondent, focusing on Iraq and ISIS, joining us tonight from Iraq. Rukmini, I really appreciate you taking the time and taking the effort to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.
We have so much news developing tonight from around the world, from around the country, from inside the White House. Stay with us tonight. Lots to come. Tonight, the Vice President, Mike Pence, returns early from an overseas trip he's been on to South and Central America this week. We're still not sure why Vice President Pence gave up his Panama trip, dinner with the president and his trip to see the Panama Canal tomorrow in order to fly back early to Washington tonight. But the vice president's office has now said that he plans tomorrow to attend a high-level national security meeting on the subject of the war in Afghanistan. Now, why does the vice president need to be there for an Afghanistan meeting? Nobody knows. If the vice president does need to be there for the Afghanistan meeting, why couldn't he just call in for the meeting? Nobody knows. We do know that what has been circulating recently in terms of the administration's plans for Afghanistan is a very provocative proposal to try to turn the Afghan war into a private, for-profit enterprise instead of an effort run by the U.S. military. This is Betsy DeVos. She's the Trump administration's education secretary, although she barely made it into the cabinet. The fight over her nomination was close enough that Vice President Pence had to come in and break the tie on the vote for her nomination. Before becoming education secretary, Betsy DeVos had no experience in the public sector at all. But she does come from one of the richest conservative political donor families in the country, as does her brother, Eric Prince, who's the founder of the private military contracting firm Blackwater. Following Blackwater's disastrous tenure in the Iraq War, Blackwater doesn't exist anymore. And Eric Prince doesn't even live in the United States anymore. But in December, he resurfaced bizarrely in the middle of the Trump-Russia story. And that has given us something new to watch for in tonight's and tomorrow's news. And that story's next. Stay with us.
The Jaguar F-Pack.
In April of this year, thanks to some truly gonzo reporting in the Washington Post, we learned that Eric Prince, the former chief of Blackwater, the brother of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, we learned that Eric Prince, of all people, took a meeting with a representative of Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Seychelles Islands. It was a meeting organized by the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates. The idea was that the Crown Prince, for some reason, whatever reason, he wanted to facilitate contact between the Trump campaign and Vladimir Putin. And the way he did it was by bringing in Putin's emissary on the one hand and Eric Prince on the other. And he held this meeting in this remote island location so they could synchronize their watches or whatever during the presidential transition. Now, the meeting reportedly happened in December. It was reported in the Washington Post in April. Eric Prince has since acknowledged that the meeting did take place and the Washington Post was right. But he's downplayed the significance of the meeting. He's described the whole purpose of those discussions, the whole purpose of him being in the Seychelles Islands, as just business. Well, we have since learned that one business proposition Eric Prince has been selling is that the U.S. government should pay him $10 billion a year so that he can run the war in Afghanistan as a private for-profit enterprise instead of as a U.S. military action. Eric Prince has done a handful of interviews on this subject. He's very proud of the idea. He has cited colonial rule under the British Empire as the model for how he thinks his private army and private air force should conduct the next X years of the Afghanistan war. The idea of the education secretary's billionaire brother being installed as a self-styled viceroy in Afghanistan to be paid billions of dollars a year by the taxpayers to run his own private war there, it's enough to curl your eyelashes, right? It's hard to believe that would ever be taken seriously outside of Hollywood. I mean, the news reports about Eric Prince making this proposal, they've generally taken the tone that this idea is not really being seriously considered by the Trump administration. Honestly, that reporting has been offered in the same non-specific spirit in which we all keep getting reassured that there are real adults in charge somewhere behind the scenes in this administration and that, therefore, nothing too terrible will happen. Forgive my skepticism. James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, was recently asked about Eric Prince's big business plan to take over the war from the U.S. military. And although we keep hearing that Secretary Mattis is one of those adults who won't let anything too weird happen, he didn't exactly sound dismissive of the idea when he was asked about it.
Mr. Secretary, does the Afghanistan strategy at this point contain any provisions for a significant number of contracted security forces or private? There's been a public discussion about significant increases like 5,000, 5,500 contracted security forces, 90 fleet private air force.
The strategic decision have not been made. It's part of the options being considered. And the president's open to the advice of the Secretary of State and myself and the Director of CIA.
It's part of the options being considered, he says. What at this point is too crazy to imagine? That the president might threaten to rain fire and fury and power like the world has never seen on North Korea? That the president might endorse a rally by white supremacists and neo-Nazis and describe them as not bad people? Is it even more inconceivable than that stuff? That the president might say the war in Afghanistan will now be run by this guy Eric from here on out? The reason, at least the stated reason, that Vice President Mike Pence is having to come home early from his overseas trip tonight is because of a meeting that's just been called to discuss Afghanistan strategy tomorrow at Camp David. That meeting will involve the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, the President, and the Vice President. We shall see what comes out of that meeting. Mike Pence was also supposed to do a bunch of Republican Party events and fundraisers this weekend in Virginia. Those events have been canceled. So again, we will see what comes out of this Afghanistan meeting. I don't think it's unreasonable to brace for some truly bizarre news on that subject. But if something like that is going to happen, if something like that is going to get announced, it's worth considering that this is a particularly difficult, challenging, in some ways strange time for the U.S. military. Partly this is a difficult time for the U.S. military because we are at war. And the military bears the entire brunt of that while the civilian world pays very little attention to it here at home. Today we learned that an Army Green Beret was killed and 11 Utah National Guardsmen were wounded in eastern Afghanistan. The young man who died has been identified by his family as 27-year-old Green Beret Aaron Butler. He's from Monticello, Utah. He was a championship high school wrestler. He was the 7th of 8 kids in his family. He was one of 7 brothers. His family says he signed up for the Utah National Guard while he was still in high school, which means even if he signed up 10 years ago, doing the math, that means the United States was already many years into the Afghanistan war when Sergeant Butler enlisted to serve in the war that eventually took his life. So the news of his death, those other 11 Utah National Guardsmen all being hurt in the same incident, that is huge and very sad news in Utah tonight, in the National Guard, in the community of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. The U.S. Navy was also rocked tonight by the publication of the Navy's first investigative report into that bizarre crash between a U.S. Navy destroyer and a Japanese cargo vessel back in June just off the coast of Japan. This is a devastating report. It describes in detail and at length how the sailors on board that destroyer fought for their own lives and fought to save each other when those two ships collided in the middle of the night. The efforts to save each other included heroic efforts to save the captain of the ship. The report describes how 5 sailors used a sledgehammer and a kettlebell from the ship's gym to smash their way into the destroyed stateroom of the ship's captain. The ship's captain, his stateroom, basically took a direct hit in that crash with the cargo ship. The sailors who were trying to save him, they did get in. The ship's captain, according to the report, was hanging off the outside of the ship for his life by the time they smashed their way into him to save his life. And those sailors were able to save him, but he will now lose his career in the Navy. The commander of the ship is being relieved of command, as will the commander who was his second in command on board, as will the command master chief who was the senior enlisted sailor on board. 7 U.S. sailors died in that crash. Apparently, the Navy has not yet determined the overall question of why the crash happened and which of the 2 ships was at fault, but without waiting for that final conclusion, they say they already know enough to fire all the top leadership of that U.S. Navy destroyer. So that is very serious news in the Navy. They're taking very dramatic action. And it can't help in a stressful and high-stakes time like this that all the branches of the military are also this week facing a new unnecessary crisis that was created out of thin air by the U.S. president. A crisis in which all the chiefs of all the branches of the U.S. military have felt the need to break with their long-standing strict practice of avoiding politics. All of the service chiefs this week have felt compelled to put out public statements bluntly disagreeing with, bluntly departing from statements made by the president on race after the Charlottesville rioting this weekend. The Navy Chief of Operations was first to respond this past weekend, saying, quote, "Events in Charlottesville are unacceptable and mustn't be tolerated. U.S. Navy forever stands against intolerance and hatred." That was followed soon thereafter by the Commandant of the Marine Corps, saying there's no place for racial hatred or extremism in the U.S. Marine Corps. That was followed by the Chief of Staff of the Army, saying the Army does not tolerate racism, extremism, or hatred in our ranks. That was followed by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who put out admittedly a slightly milder statement saying, "I stand with my fellow service chiefs in saying we are all always stronger together." Less blunt, but I think we know what he means. That was followed by the Chief of the National Guard, who spoke more directly. He said, quote, "I stand with my fellow Joint Chiefs in condemning racism, extremism, and hatred. Our diversity is our strength." Service chiefs in the military don't usually do this, let alone the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But tonight, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Joseph Dunford, said this to Voice of America.
I can absolutely and unambiguously tell you that there's no place for racism and bigotry in the U.S. military or in the United States as a whole.
Or in the United States as a whole. The service chief, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, they stay apolitical. They stay out of domestic politics strictly, both stylistically and literally as a rule, they stay out of it. Uniformed military personnel are not allowed to be involved in partisan politics, and the military brass lives that ethos every day. That said, even when the civilian leadership of the U.S. government is making nice with and being complimentary to white supremacists, the military feels a need to separate. The military has its own very acute history on the subject and its own operational reasons to make clear that they're not following this president down that particular political path. Here's just one example. You might remember in April 2014, there was a multiple murder in Kansas, a domestic terrorist attack that targeted a Jewish community center and a Jewish retirement home in Overland Park, Kansas. This nutty old man who committed those murders was a committed, lifelong white supremacist and neo-Nazi. He shouted Heil Hitler after he was arrested. He acted as his own lawyer at his trial. He gave the Nazi salute in the courtroom after he was convicted. He said his only regret about the murders was that none of the people he actually killed turned out to be Jewish, even though he picked those locations for his attack in the hopes that he'd be singling out Jews to murder. At his trial, he unsuccessfully tried to introduce video evidence from his past leadership of a uniformed group of white supremacists in North Carolina. Turns out he'd been a founding member of the White Patriots Party in North Carolina in the 80s. Before that, it had been called the Confederate Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Before that, it had been the Carolina Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And they, in fact, wore military uniforms, and they marched in military formation. They did military-style training. They also freaked a lot of people out at the time by the fact that they seemed to have access to some military-grade weapons. One of the things that was most unsettling about those Klan groups and that White Patriots Party when it emerged, and they started doing all these marches and demonstrations in the 80s, is that their leader at the time, the guy who all those years later would end up shooting those people at a Jewish community center in Kansas, their leader back in the 80s when he was running the White Patriots Party in those Klan chapters, turns out he had built up his leadership skills, his organizational skills, his weapons training and military training, which he imbued to those Klan groups. He'd built it up while he served for 20 years in the United States Army. But the instructive thing to know about that now is that when the Army, even way back in the day, when the Army figured out what they were dealing with him, they kicked him out. He participated in the Greensboro Massacre in 1979, when Klan groups and Nazi groups ambushed a lefty march and rally in Greensboro, North Carolina. They murdered 5 people. He was in the National Socialist movement at the time. He was in the American, basically, Nazi Party at the time and attended that ambush. And the Army thereafter kicked him out for distributing racist propaganda after they found that he had participated in that event. The U.S. Army, all the branches of the military, have long had a policy of kicking people out if they find them to be part of racist or extremist groups or involved in racist or extremist organizing. Under Ronald Reagan in 1986, Secretary of Defense Cap Weinberger issued a special directive re-upping that principle for all branches of the military. September 1986, he sent out a priority message reminding all services that all military personnel duty-bound to uphold the Constitution must reject participation in supremacist organizations. A few years later, in 1990, 5 Air Force MPs were thrown out of service for being Klan members. 1995, when they caught the guys who did the Oklahoma City bombing, it emerged that they had first met and made friends in the 1st Infantry Division at Fort Riley in Kansas. Partially in response to that, in 1996, the military re-upped and strengthened its anti-extremism regulations. Military personnel must reject participation in organizations that espouse supremacist causes. Quote, commanders have authority to employ the full range of administrative procedures, including separation or disciplinary action against military personnel who actively participate in such groups. Then in 2009, they re-upped it again. They clarified that you could be thrown out of the service for fundraising or demonstrating or rallying or recruiting or training or organizing or leading members of supremacist groups. You could be thrown out of the service for distributing racist materials. In 2012, they re-upped it again, making clear that you could be thrown out of the service, you could be prevented from joining the service. Not only if you actually do all of that active stuff to participate in racist groups, but even if you have a tattoo or a body marking that is associated with a racist or extremist group like that. The military literally now gives commanders an extremist tattoo decision support matrix. So you can get advice in figuring out whether that stupid winged dragon on your recruit's forearm is just a stupid winged dragon, or maybe it's a Nazi winged dragon. The U.S. military has as much of a white supremacist infection as the rest of American society. The difference between the U.S. military and the rest of us is that in the U.S. military, it's not just terrible to be a Nazi scumbag. In the U.S. military, it is illegal to be a Nazi scumbag. And they freaking police it.